The woman everyone overlooked lived a life so quiet that most people never noticed when she entered or left a room. Her name was Nadia. She was in her early 30s, though the tired look in her eyes sometimes made her seem older. She worked long hours at a grand hotel in the center of the city. It was the kind of place where chandeliers sparkled like stars and polished floors reflected the light like mirrors. Guests arrived in expensive cars, wearing clothes that cost more than Nadia earned in months. She cleaned their rooms, carried trays, and kept her head down. To most people, she was just part of the background. A shadow in a uniform. Nadia never complained. She moved through her tasks with quiet focus. She folded sheets carefully, wiped tables until they shined, and always said yes, sir, or yes, ma'am in a soft voice. Some guests were kind. They smiled and thanked her. But many didn't even look at her face. They spoke about her as if she were invisible. It hurt sometimes, but she had learned long ago not to let it show. She lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city. It was simple but clean. A narrow bed stood near the window. A wooden table sat in the corner with two chairs that didn't match. The paint on the walls had faded, and the floor creaked when she walked. But it was her space and she kept it neat. Every evening, after long hours at work, she returned home, took off her shoes, and sat quietly by the window. There was one thing in her apartment that did not match the rest of the room. Against the far wall stood an old upright piano. It had scratches on its surface and one key that made a slightly dull sound. It was not shiny or grand like the ones in the hotel ballroom, but to Nadia it was more valuable than anything else she owned. The piano had belonged to her father. When Nadia was a little girl, her father had been a music teacher. He was not rich, but he carried himself with pride. He believed music was not just sound. He believed it was a way to speak without words. He used to tell her, "When your heart feels heavy, let your hands speak for you." From the age of 5, Nadia sat beside him at that piano. Her feet barely touched the floor back then. She practiced every day after school. Sometimes she cried when the lessons were difficult. Her father was strict, but he was never cruel. He wanted her to be strong. He wanted her to feel the power of music inside her bones. He would guide her fingers gently when she made mistakes. "Again," he would say softly. "You can do better." And she always tried. By the time she was 12, Nadia could play pieces that surprised even adults. At small local events, neighbors would gather just to hear her perform. She was shy, but once she touched the keys, something changed. Her back straightened. Her hands moved with confidence. The nervous girl disappeared, and in her place was someone calm and powerful. But life is not always kind to talent. When Nadia was 16, her father became sick. The hospital visits grew frequent. The medical bills grew larger. Her mother worked extra hours at a tailoring shop, but it was not enough. The piano lessons stopped. The house grew quiet in a different way. One winter morning, her father did not wake up. After that day, music felt different. The house felt empty. The piano keys felt cold. Nadia tried to play, but every note reminded her of him. It hurt too much. She closed the piano lid and did not open it again for a long time. Without her father's income, the family struggled. Nadia left school early to help support her mother. She worked at small shops, washed dishes in restaurants, and did whatever she could find. Dreams of music slowly faded into the background of survival. Years passed. Her mother passed away too, quietly, after a short illness. By then, Nadia was already working at the hotel. She had learned how to survive without expecting much from life. The piano was the only thing she refused to sell, even when money was tight. She moved it with her from one small apartment to another. People often asked why she kept such a heavy old instrument in such a tiny place. She would just smile and say, "It belonged to my father." What she never told them was that some nights, when the city outside became silent, she would open the lid and press a few keys. At first, her hands would shake. It had been years since she practiced seriously. But slowly, the muscle memory returned. Her fingers remembered patterns her mind had almost forgotten. The melodies came back like old friends knocking gently on a closed door. She never played loudly. She was careful not to disturb neighbors. The music stayed soft, almost like a whisper meant only for her own heart. At work, no one knew about this part of her life. The hotel ballroom had a grand piano placed near the stage. It was large, black, and polished until it reflected the ceiling lights. It was mostly used during weddings and special events. Professional musicians came in dressed in elegant suits and gowns. They performed for wealthy guests who clapped politely and returned to their conversations. Sometimes, when Nadia entered the ballroom to clean after an event, she would pause for just a second. She would glance at the piano from a distance. Her eyes would rest on the keys as if greeting an old friend across a crowded room. But she never touched it. Not once. She knew her place, or at least that's what she told herself. She was staff. The piano was for performers hired by the hotel. Crossing that invisible line felt impossible. Her coworkers saw her as quiet and serious. Some thought she was shy. Others assumed she had no dreams beyond her daily job. They talked about fashion, movies, and weekend outings. Nadia listened but rarely joined in. It wasn't that she didn't care. She simply felt like she lived in a different world. Still, she was kind to everyone. When a new worker struggled to carry heavy trays, she would help without being asked. When someone felt sick, she covered their shift. She never raised her voice. Even when guests were rude, she responded with calm patience. Deep inside, though, there was a part of her that still belonged to music. One evening, as she was cleaning near the ballroom after a wedding reception, she noticed the hired pianist packing up his sheet music. He had played beautifully that night. Guests had applauded loudly. Nadia stood near the doorway, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement, just so she could listen to the final notes. As the pianist closed the piano lid, he sighed and said to no one in particular, "People clap, but they don't really listen." The words stayed with her. That night, back in her apartment, Nadia sat at her old piano and played for longer than usual. The melody rose and fell with deep emotion. Her hands moved faster than they had in years. It felt like something inside her had woken up again. When she finished, tears ran down her face. Not from sadness alone, but from something she could not fully explain. It was a mix of loss, memory, and hope. She realized then that no matter how simple her life looked from the outside, there was something inside her that no one could take away. She just didn't know yet that very soon, the world around her would discover it too. For now, she remained the quiet woman in a uniform, moving through shining hallways with a gentle step. No one guessed that beneath her calm face lived years of discipline, sacrifice, and hidden talent. They saw a simple worker. They did not see the girl who once filled rooms with music. And they certainly did not know that one unexpected night would change everything. The night of the grand celebration arrived on a warm Saturday evening. The hotel looked brighter than usual. Crystal lights shimmered from the ceiling, and fresh flowers lined the entrance. Luxury cars filled the parking area, and guests walked in dressed in elegant suits and long flowing dresses. Laughter and loud voices echoed through the hallway. It was clear that this was not an ordinary event. A wealthy businessman had rented the entire ballroom to celebrate a major business deal. The staff had been preparing for this night for weeks. Everything had to be perfect: the table settings, the lighting, the music, the food. Nadia had been assigned to help serve drinks and clear tables during the party. She tied her hair neatly into a low bun and adjusted her simple uniform before stepping into the ballroom. The grand piano stood near the stage, polished until it shined like glass. Soft instrumental music played through speakers while guests arrived and greeted one another. At first, the atmosphere felt formal. People spoke politely, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. But as the evening continued, drinks were poured generously. Conversations grew louder. Laughter became heavier. The room shifted from formal to relaxed. Nadia moved carefully between tables, balancing trays of glasses. She kept her eyes focused on her work, just like always. She was used to being around wealthy guests who barely noticed her presence. Still, tonight felt slightly different. There was a bold energy in the air, as if something unexpected might happen. After dinner was served, a small group of guests gathered near the piano. One of them, A tall man with a loud voice joked that the hired musician was late. Another guest laughed and said maybe someone from the staff should play instead. The group burst into laughter at the idea. Nadia was standing only a few steps away, collecting empty plates. One of the men noticed her. He pointed casually in her direction and said, "Look, she's standing right there. Maybe she can give us a performance." More laughter followed. Nadia froze for a moment, unsure if they were serious. She forced a small polite smile and continued stacking plates, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. The host of the party, who had already had several drinks, turned around to see what the joke was about. When someone repeated the suggestion, he grinned widely. "Why not?" he said loudly. "It will be fun. Come on, let's see what she can do." The group encouraged the idea, clapping and teasing. It wasn't pure cruelty, but it wasn't kind either. It had the tone of people who expected entertainment, not talent. Nadia felt her heart begin to pound. She shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I don't know how to play." It was a lie, but it felt safer. "Oh, come on," one of the guests insisted. "Just press a few keys. We need some comedy tonight." More guests began turning their heads toward the scene. Phones were lifted in curiosity. The music from the speakers had already stopped, and now the room felt focused on this unexpected moment. The host waved his hand in a playful but commanding way. "Just one song," he said. "We insist. It's just for fun." Nadia looked around for help, but the other staff members were busy, pretending not to notice. She understood why. No one wanted to challenge a wealthy client. Refusing too strongly might create trouble for her job. Her palms felt damp. She could feel the heat rising to her face. The laughter around her was not loud anymore, but it carried a tone that made her feel small. She stepped closer to the piano slowly, hoping maybe someone would interrupt and stop the situation. But instead, more people gathered around. A circle formed. The bright lights from above reflected on the piano's surface. "Go on," someone said softly, almost whispering with amusement. Nadia stood beside the piano bench. For a second, she considered walking away. But she imagined the manager hearing complaints later. She imagined whispers among guests about rude staff. She could not afford to lose this job. She sat down. The bench felt familiar, even though this piano was much grander than the one in her apartment. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surface. She barely recognized the nervous woman looking back. Someone in the crowd chuckled. "This will be interesting," he said. The words stung. Nadia placed her hands in her lap. Her fingers felt cold despite the warm room. She had not touched this piano before, but it was still a piano. The keys were the same shape. The notes were the same. She closed her eyes for just a moment. The noise in the room seemed distant. She remembered her father's voice telling her to breathe before playing. She remembered how he used to tap the piano lightly and say, "Let the music start from here," pointing to her heart. When she opened her eyes, the crowd was waiting. She knew they expected random noise. They expected awkwardness, maybe even embarrassment. For a brief second, she considered giving them exactly that, pressing random keys and ending the moment quickly. It would satisfy their joke, and she could return to work unnoticed. But something inside her resisted that idea. Her hands slowly moved toward the keyboard. The white and black keys stretched out in front of her like an old path she once walked every day. The room had grown quieter now. Curiosity replaced laughter. One guest raised his phone higher, ready to record what he thought would be a funny clip. Nadia took a deep breath. She pressed a single key. The sound echoed clearly through the ballroom. It was not clumsy or loud. It was controlled. A few people exchanged glances. Then she placed her other hand on the keys. She let her fingers rest there for a second longer. Her heartbeat slowed slightly. She wasn't ready yet. Not fully. The pressure in the room felt heavy. She could feel eyes watching every small movement. But instead of shrinking under that weight, something unexpected began to rise inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was memory. She remembered the small room where she first learned to play. She remembered practicing while rain tapped against the window. She remembered her father smiling quietly when she mastered a difficult part. The crowd around her faded in importance. She adjusted her posture without even thinking about it. Her back straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. The nervous worker disappeared for a moment. The tall man who had started the joke leaned forward slightly, curious now instead of amused. "Come on," someone whispered. Nadia finally let her fingers move. The first few notes were soft, almost gentle. Not loud enough to demand attention, but clear enough to change the mood. The melody began slowly, like a story opening its first page. The guests did not laugh. They listened, and in that quiet space between expectation and reality, something began to shift, though none of them fully understood it yet. The simple woman they had called forward for entertainment was not playing randomly. She was beginning to tell a story through music. And the night was only just beginning. The first few notes floated gently through the ballroom, soft but clear. The sound was not loud, yet it carried in a way that made people stop whispering. Nadia kept her eyes on the keys. She did not look at the guests. She did not look at the phones pointed in her direction. She focused only on the music. At the beginning, her hands moved carefully, as if testing the piano. Every instrument feels different. Every key responds in its own way. But within seconds, her fingers adjusted. The grand piano responded smoothly under her touch. The sound was rich, deeper than the old upright piano in her apartment. It almost felt like the instrument itself was waiting for someone who understood it. A few guests exchanged confused looks. This was not what they expected. The tall man who had started the joke straightened his posture. His smile slowly faded. The host, who had been leaning casually against a table, lowered his glass without realizing it. Nadia let the melody grow stronger. The soft introduction turned into something fuller, more emotional. Her left hand carried a steady rhythm, while her right hand moved with gentle speed across the higher keys. It was not random. It was controlled and confident. She was not playing for them anymore. She was playing for herself. As the music filled the room, memories rose inside her. She remembered the small living room where she first practiced scales again and again. She remembered her father correcting her posture, guiding her wrist, telling her to relax her fingers. She remembered the day he told her she was ready to perform in front of others. Back then, she had been nervous too. But once she started playing, the fear always disappeared. Now, years later, that same feeling returned. The ballroom grew completely silent. The staff members near the doors stopped moving. One of the waiters who had been carrying a tray slowly set it down on a nearby table without taking his eyes off her. Even the sound of cutlery and glasses faded as guests turned their attention toward the piano. Nadia's breathing steadied. Her hands no longer trembled. They moved with natural flow, as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. The melody shifted into a more powerful section. It rose higher, then dipped lower, like waves moving across a calm sea. The emotion in the music became impossible to ignore. It was not showy or dramatic in an artificial way. It was honest. A woman standing near the front felt a sudden chill run through her arms. She had come expecting an awkward moment. Instead, she felt something touching her heart. One of the younger guests slowly lowered his phone. He had been recording for humor, but now he found himself simply listening. Nadia still did not look up. If she had, she might have felt nervous again. Instead, she allowed her fingers to continue telling the story she carried inside her. The piece she chose was one her father had loved. It was not the most difficult composition in the world, but it required feeling. Without emotion, it would sound empty. With emotion, it could move people deeply. Her hands grew more confident with every passing second. The music built toward a stronger middle section. The notes became faster, more intense. Her fingers crossed over each other with precision. Her wrists lifted and dropped gracefully. The tall man who had laughed earlier felt his face grow warm. He realized he had misjudged her completely. The host of the party slowly stepped closer to the piano. His expression had changed. There was no amusement left in it. Only surprise. The room that had once been filled with loud conversations now felt almost sacred. As Nadia reached the most powerful part of the piece, her entire posture transformed. She was no longer the quiet hotel worker. She looked like someone who belonged on a stage. Her back was straight, her chin slightly lifted, her movements controlled but passionate. Each note rang clearly through the ballroom. A few guests felt their eyes sting unexpectedly. They could not explain why. The music carried a mix of sadness and strength. Felt like a story of loss but also survival. Nadia felt tears forming in her own eyes, but she did not let them fall. She poured everything into the keys instead. Every memory of struggle. Every silent night in her small apartment. Every moment she felt invisible. The music became her voice. In one corner of the room, an older guest who had once studied music himself stood frozen. He recognized skill when he heard it. This was not beginner talent. This was years of training hidden behind a simple uniform. The final section of the piece approached. It softened again, like a deep breath after a storm. Nadia's hands slowed slightly. The powerful notes faded into gentle ones. The melody returned to where it had begun, quiet and thoughtful. No one dared to speak. The last few notes lingered in the air. Her fingers pressed the final chord with steady confidence. Then silence. Not awkward silence. Real silence. The kind of silence that happens when people are too moved to react immediately. Nadia kept her hands resting lightly on the keys for a second longer. She slowly lifted them and placed them back in her lap. Her heart was beating fast again, but for a different reason now. She finally looked up. The expressions around her were nothing like before. The laughter was gone. The mocking smiles had disappeared. In their place were wide eyes and open mouths. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a single clap broke the silence. It was soft at first. Then another clap joined it. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. The sound was loud and genuine. It echoed off the high ceiling and crystal lights. Some guests even stood up without realizing it. Nadia blinked, almost confused. She had not expected this reaction. She had only wanted the moment to end quickly. But the applause did not fade. It grew stronger. The tall man who had made the joke clapped harder than most. The host stepped forward and shook his head slowly, as if still trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Nadia felt heat rush to her face again, but this time it was not from embarrassment. It was from disbelief. She stood up slowly from the bench. The room was still clapping. For the first time that night she felt seen. Not as a worker, not as background, but as a person. And in that moment, something shifted inside everyone who had laughed at her just minutes earlier. They had expected a joke. Instead, they had discovered a hidden story sitting quietly among them all along. The applause did not stop quickly. It rolled through the ballroom in waves, strong and steady. Nadia stood beside the piano bench, unsure of what to do with her hands. She had faced silence before in her life, but never this kind of noise directed at her. Felt overwhelming. Some guests were still standing. Others were whispering to each other with expressions of disbelief. A few people shook their heads slowly, as if trying to wake up from a dream. The mood in the room had changed completely. The playful teasing from earlier felt distant and embarrassing now. The host stepped forward first. His face, which had earlier held a careless smile, now looked serious. He approached the piano slowly, as though he was walking toward something fragile. That was... He paused, searching for the right words. That was incredible. His voice was no longer loud or joking. It was honest. Nadia lowered her eyes politely. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly. The tall man who had started the whole situation came closer too. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't know," he said quietly. We didn't know." She gave a small nod. There was no anger in her expression, only calm. Around them, guests began asking questions all at once. "Where did you learn to play? Are you a professional musician? Why are you working here?" The questions came quickly, overlapping each other. Nadia felt dizzy for a moment. She was not used to so many eyes on her, especially not with admiration instead of dismissal. The hotel manager, who had been watching nervously from near the entrance, now walked forward with a forced smile. At first, he had been worried the situation would upset the guests. Now he seemed eager to turn this unexpected moment into something impressive for the hotel's image. "We are very proud of our talented staff," he announced loudly, as if he had known about her ability all along. Nadia felt a strange mix of emotions at those words. No one had ever asked about her talents before, but she stayed silent. One of the guests, an older woman with kind eyes, stepped closer and gently touched Nadia's arm. "You play with so much feeling," she said warmly. "It felt like you were telling us something personal." Nadia swallowed softly. "Music was my first love," she replied after a moment. "I just haven't played in front of people for a long time." The crowd quieted again, listening. "Why did you stop?" someone asked from the side. She hesitated. Sharing personal pain in a room full of strangers felt uncomfortable. But something about the atmosphere had softened. The mockery was gone. In its place was genuine curiosity. "My father taught me," she said simply. "After he passed away, life became different. I had to work. Music had to wait." There was no dramatic tone in her voice, just simple truth. The words hung in the air. They made her performance feel even deeper. Suddenly, the piece she had played carried new meaning for the listeners. It wasn't just skill. It was memory. The tall man looked down at the floor for a second. The host cleared his throat, visibly moved. "You should never have stopped," he said quietly. Nadia gave a faint smile. "Sometimes we don't choose," she answered. In another corner of the room stood a guest who had been unusually silent during the entire scene. He was middle-aged, dressed in a simple but elegant suit. Unlike many others, he had not laughed earlier. He had simply observed. Now he stepped forward. "I work with a local arts foundation," he said calmly. "We sponsor musicians who have potential but lack opportunity. I have attended many concerts. What I heard tonight was not ordinary." The room shifted again. Guests turned their attention toward him. He continued, "With training again and proper guidance, you could perform on real stages." Nadia felt her breath catch in her chest. The idea felt almost impossible. She had long ago pushed such dreams aside. They belonged to another life, another version of herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted honestly. "You were ready tonight," he replied gently. Silence settled again, but this time it felt hopeful. The host suddenly clapped his hands together with renewed energy. "Well," he said with a smile, "I think this party just became unforgettable." Laughter returned, but now it was warm and respectful. Several guests asked if she would play another piece. At first, Nadia hesitated. She had already given more than she expected, but something inside her felt lighter. The fear that had gripped her earlier was gone. In its place was quiet confidence. She sat down at the piano again. This time there were no teasing comments, no raised eyebrows, only anticipation. She chose a softer melody, something gentle and peaceful. The music flowed easily. Without pressure, she allowed herself to enjoy the moment fully. She could feel the connection between her hands and the instrument, and beyond that, the connection between her music and the listeners. Some guests closed their eyes while she played. Others held their breath. When she finished the second piece, the applause came again, steady and sincere. But what mattered most to her was not the applause. It was the change in the room. Earlier that night, she had felt small under their gaze. Now she felt equal. Not above them, not below them. Simply human. After she stood up again, several guests approached her individually. They introduced themselves properly this time. They shook her hand. Some apologized for laughing earlier. "You surprised us," one admitted. "In the best way." She responded with grace. "Thank you for listening." As the night continued, the party returned to its celebrations. But the energy had shifted permanently. Conversations felt softer. There was less arrogance in the air. It was as if her music had gently reminded everyone of something important. Near the end of the evening, as guests began to leave, the man from the Arts Foundation approached her once more. He handed her a small card. "If you ever decide to try again," he said kindly, "call me. Talent like yours should not remain hidden." She took the card carefully, as though it were fragile. When the ballroom finally emptied and the lights dimmed, Nadia remained alone near the piano for a moment. The room was quiet again, but not in the same way as before. She ran her fingers lightly across the smooth surface of the instrument, not pressing any keys this time. Tonight had started with embarrassment. It had turned into something she never expected. As she helped the other staff clean up, her coworkers looked at her differently. Some smiled with pride. Others shook their heads in amazement. "You never told us," one whispered. She simply shrugged. No one asked. Later, walking home under the streetlights, she held the small card tightly in her hand. The city around her looked the same as always. Cars passed. Shops closed for the night. The world continued as usual. But inside her, something had changed. For years, she had treated her music like a memory. Tonight, it felt like a future. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she would ever stand on a stage again. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine it. And that quiet imagination was more powerful than any applause. Because this time, the world had not laughed. The world had listened. The night after the party, Nadia could not sleep easily. She lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the city outside slowly grew quiet. The applause from the ballroom kept replaying in her mind. The sound felt unreal, like something she had imagined instead of lived. On the small wooden table beside her bed lay the business card the man from the Arts Foundation had given her. She had placed it there carefully, as if it might disappear if she touched it too much. Several times during the night, she turned her head just to make sure it was still there. Part of her felt excited. Another part felt afraid. For years, she had built her life around safety. A steady job, a small apartment, simple routines. There was comfort in knowing what each day would look like. Music belonged to her private world. It was something she played quietly at night, not something she shared with strangers. But now strangers had heard her, and they had listened. The next morning at work, everything felt slightly different. As she walked through the hotel entrance, she noticed two receptionists whispering while looking in her direction. One of them smiled when their eyes met. "Good morning," they said warmly. She returned the greeting, confused but polite. In the staff room, more people seemed aware of her. One of the waiters clapped lightly when she entered. "The star has arrived," he joked. But this time there was no teasing in his voice. Nadia felt shy under the attention. She quickly changed into her uniform and focused on tying her apron. "Please," she said softly. "It was just a small moment." "It wasn't small," another worker replied. "My cousin saw a video online this morning. Someone recorded you and posted it." Her heart skipped. "Posted it?" "Yes, it's everywhere. People are sharing it." A strange feeling filled her chest. She had not thought about the phones in the crowd. She had not imagined the moment traveling beyond the ballroom walls. During her break, she borrowed a coworker's phone and searched for the video. It did not take long to find it. There she was, sitting at the grand piano wearing her simple uniform. The caption read something about a hotel worker surprising rich guests. She watched the clip carefully. The camera had captured the change in the room. The laughter fading, the silence growing, the applause rising. She could see her own face at the end, surprised and almost overwhelmed. The comments below the video surprised her even more. People wrote about being moved. Some said the music made them cry. Others talked about hidden talent and never judging by appearance. Many praised her courage. She handed the phone back slowly, unsure how to feel. It was strange to see herself through the eyes of others. By afternoon, even the hotel manager called her into his office. He sat behind his desk with a wide smile. "You have brought unexpected attention to our hotel," he said. "Guests are asking about you." She stood quietly, unsure if this was praise or warning. I want you to know, he continued, that we support your talent. If opportunities come your way, we will try to be flexible with your schedule. She nodded politely. Thank you. As she left the office, she felt something shifting again. For so long, she had moved unnoticed. Now doors seemed slightly open. That evening, when she returned to her apartment, she did not go straight to bed. She walked to the old upright piano and lifted the lid slowly. The familiar smell of aged wood and dust greeted her. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. But tonight, her thoughts were not only about memory, they were about possibility. After playing for a while, she reached for the business card on the table. She stared at the number for a long time. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen. Calling meant stepping into the unknown. It meant risking disappointment. It meant believing in herself again. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind. You can do better. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. The line rang twice before someone answered. It was the same calm voice from the party. I was hoping you would call, he said gently when she introduced herself. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He explained that the foundation often arranged private auditions. There was no pressure, he assured her. Just a chance to see where her skills stood after the years away from formal training. Would you be willing to come this weekend? He asked. Her hands tightened around the phone. Yes, she replied before fear could stop her. The next few days felt longer than usual. At work, guests sometimes recognized her from the video. Some asked for photos. Others simply thanked her for the performance. She handled the attention quietly, never letting it change her behavior. But inside, she practiced every night. She played scales again, slowly at first. Her fingers felt stiff from years without serious training. But muscle memory returned faster than she expected. The discipline her father had built into her hands had not disappeared completely. She corrected her posture in the mirror. She adjusted her timing. She repeated difficult sections until they felt smooth again. There were moments of frustration. Notes slipped. Her speed faltered. Doubt whispered that maybe the party had been luck, that maybe she was not as good as people believed. But then she would close her eyes and remember the silence in that ballroom. She would remember the way the room had changed. That had not been luck. Saturday arrived quickly. The Arts Foundation building was simple but elegant. It was not as flashy as the hotel ballroom, but it carried quiet dignity. Framed photographs of musicians lined the hallway walls. Nadia's heart beat fast as she entered. Inside a small audition room stood another grand piano. Not as large as the hotel's, but beautifully maintained. Two judges sat at a table with notepads. The man who had given her the card smiled reassuringly from the side. She walked toward the piano slowly. This time there was no mocking crowd, no laughter, no teasing voices, just expectation. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The room filled with the same honesty she had shown at the party. But this time her focus was sharper. She let the music rise and fall naturally. She allowed every note to carry meaning. When she finished, the silence returned once more. One of the judges leaned back and nodded slowly. The other wrote something on the notepad before looking up with a small smile. "Where have you been hiding?" the older judge asked kindly. Nadia felt her eyes grow warm. "I wasn't hiding," she answered softly. "I was surviving." The judges exchanged thoughtful glances. "We would like to offer you a place in our development program," the man from the foundation said gently. "It will require hard work, practice, public performances again. But we believe you are ready." For a moment, Nadia could not speak. Years of quiet sacrifice, of pushing dreams aside, of believing that chapter was closed. All of it rushed back at once. She nodded slowly. "I'm ready to work." As she stepped outside the building later that day, the sunlight felt brighter than usual. The city noise sounded different. Not louder but clearer. Her life was still simple. She still had her small apartment. She still had her job at the hotel for now. But something inside her had changed permanently. The woman they once called forward to be a joke was now being invited to step onto real stages again. And this time, she would not close the piano lid for years. This time, she would keep playing. The weeks that followed felt both exciting and exhausting for Nadia. Her life no longer moved in one straight line between the hotel and her small apartment. Now there was something new added to her routine: rehearsals, coaching sessions, and long hours at the Arts Foundation building. Every evening after work, instead of going straight home to rest, she traveled across the city for training. The foundation assigned her a mentor, an older pianist with calm eyes and a patient voice. He did not treat her like a beginner, but he also did not ignore the years she had spent away from serious practice. "You still have strong control," he told her during one session. "But your hands need endurance again. Talent is there. We just need to wake it fully." So she practiced. At first, her fingers would ache after long sessions. Her shoulders would feel stiff. Some nights she returned home so tired that she barely had the energy to eat. But inside her, there was a quiet fire that refused to dim. At the hotel, word continued to spread. Guests sometimes requested to see the woman who had played at the famous party. A few even asked if she would perform again. The management decided to place a small upright piano in a quiet corner of the lounge area. It was not a grand stage, but it was a start. One evening, the manager approached her gently. "If you feel comfortable," he said, "perhaps you could play during the weekend tea service. Nothing official. Just background music." The idea made her nervous. Playing once under pressure was one thing. Playing regularly with people watching by choice felt different. But she agreed. That Saturday, she wore the same simple uniform. She did not want special treatment. She sat at the small piano in the lounge while guests sipped tea and talked softly. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment. This time there was no mockery, no forced laughter, just gentle conversation in the background. She began to play. The notes flowed softly through the room. Guests slowly turned their heads. Conversations became quieter. Some recognized her from the video and smiled. Others simply enjoyed the unexpected beauty of live music filling the space. She did not need applause anymore. The soft clink of teacups and the calm expressions around her were enough. As weeks passed, the foundation arranged her first small public recital. It would not be in a grand concert hall, but in a modest community theater. Still, to Nadia it felt enormous. On the day of the recital, she stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly. She wore a simple dark dress the foundation had provided. It was elegant but not flashy. She wanted the music to speak, not her appearance. The audience slowly filled the seats. Some were supporters of the foundation. Some were curious people who had seen the viral video. A few were guests from the hotel who had decided to attend. Backstage, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She remembered the first night in the ballroom. She remembered how small she had felt walking toward the piano under laughter. Tonight was different. Tonight she was walking toward the stage by choice. When her name was announced, the applause felt warm but respectful. She stepped into the soft stage light and walked to the grand piano waiting at the center. She sat down carefully. The theater grew quiet. Her fingers touched the keys and she began. The first piece was strong and confident. Every note carried the weight of her journey. The childhood lessons, the long years of silence, the unexpected night at the hotel, and the courage to call that number. She no longer played like someone trying to prove herself. She played like someone who had rediscovered her voice. As the music filled the theater, she felt something she had not felt in many years: freedom. She was not thinking about judgment. She was not worried about mistakes. She was simply present with the music. When she finished the final piece, the applause rose slowly, then grew louder. People stood up. Some wiped their eyes. Others smiled proudly. In the front row, the tall man from the original party sat quietly, clapping with genuine respect. He had come after seeing the announcement online. After the show, he approached her with humility. "I'm glad you didn't let that night hurt you," he said softly. "You turned it into something beautiful." She smiled gently. "It helped me remember who I was." The host of the party had also sent flowers with a simple note. "Thank you for teaching us not to judge too quickly." But what mattered most to Nadia was not the apologies or praise. It was the quiet feeling inside her that she had stepped back into her own life. Over the next months, more opportunities came. Small concerts led to larger ones. Interviews followed. People asked about her story, about how it felt to go from hotel worker to performing musician. She always answered honestly. "I was always both," she would say. "I just forgot for a while." Eventually, she reduced her hours at the hotel. The manager congratulated her warmly. "You gave this place a story we will never forget," he said. On her last official day of work, the staff gathered in the lounge where she had played so many afternoons. They presented her with a small gift, a framed photo of her at the piano during that first tea service performance. She looked at the photo for a long time. "I will never forget this place," she told them sincerely. It was where everything changed. That evening, she returned to her apartment one last time before moving to a slightly larger place closer to the foundation. The old upright piano still stood against the wall. She ran her fingers across its surface. It had been with her through grief, silence, doubt, and hope. Before leaving, she sat down and played a soft melody, the same one her father loved. The notes echoed gently in the small room, just as they had years ago. But this time they did not carry sadness. They carried gratitude. She understood now that being simple was never a weakness. Working quietly, living modestly, surviving difficult years. None of it had taken away her talent. It had only shaped her strength. The world had tried to laugh at her once. Instead, it had listened. And the simple woman who had once been called to the piano as a joke now walked onto stages with steady confidence. Not because she wanted to prove others wrong, but because she finally remembered her own worth. And from that point on, she never played in the shadows again.